Henry Moore entered the grand ballroom, its chandeliers casting cascades of shimmering light over the sea of formally dressed attendees. The low hum of conversation and the soft strains of a string quartet enveloped the room, but none of it registered in Henry's mind as he scanned the crowd. He wore a tailored suit, the crisp black fabric a stark reminder of formal gatherings long past. He was here on business, he reminded himself. As the CEO of Moore Enterprises, public appearances were part of the job. Yet tonight, a strange feeling gnawed at the edge of his consciousness, a restless whisper that something awaited him. The murmur of voices parted like the sea as Henry's gaze locked onto a woman across the room. The glass of champagne in his hand trembled as a familiar shock coursed through his veins. The woman's auburn hair caught the golden glow of the chandeliers, cascading over her shoulders with an ease that made his breath hitch. But it wasn't just her hair. It was her profile, the slope of her nose, the subtle curve of her lips. It was like seeing a ghost. Elizabeth, memories surged. Her laugh that once filled rooms with light. The last time he had held her hand. Her smile in those final moments before everything went dark. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself against the wave of grief that never truly left him. The woman turned slightly, laughing at something the man beside her said, and the sound reached Henry's ears, soft and melodic. It was different, and yet too familiar. He set his drink on a passing server's tray, his mind racing. Was it truly possible, after all these years? Elizabeth had been gone for nearly a decade. Her death, ruled a suicide, had never sat right with him. Mr. Moore, a voice interrupted his trance. One of his board members stood beside him, oblivious to Henry's inner turmoil. I need to discuss the latest reports. Not now, Henry cut him off, eyes never leaving the mysterious woman. He wove through the crowd, each step heavy with anticipation, heart thundering in his chest. He approached carefully, not wanting to startle her. As he neared, the woman turned and caught his gaze. Her eyes, a striking blue, met his with a momentary flicker of surprise, then softened with curiosity. "Hello," she said, her voice lacking Elizabeth's low timbre but carrying an unspoken familiarity. "Do I know you?" Henry's breath stalled. Up close, the similarities were uncanny, yet there were hints of difference, shadows that reminded him this was not his late wife. He managed a stiff smile, masking the whirlwind inside. "No, I don't believe we've met," he said, though the truth of his words felt hollow. "I'm Henry Moore." She extended a delicate hand, her expression polite but searching. "Megan Porter." "A pleasure, Mr. Moore." The name hit him like a splash of cold water, dispelling the fog for a moment. Megan Porter, not Elizabeth. But as their hands touched, he couldn't shake the unsettling déjà vu. The world around Henry seemed to recede as he withdrew into his memories. The murmur of the ballroom dulled, overtaken by the sound of rushing waves that pulled him back a decade. He remembered that late summer afternoon when the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of the sea. Elizabeth stood by the shore, her hair tousled by the wind, eyes twinkling as if sharing a secret only they knew. It had been their final vacation together, days before the news that shattered their world. Henry had stared at the empty space beside him on their drive back to the city, unable to accept the tight-lipped silence that would soon become permanent. Then, there was the day they told him it was suicide. He had replayed those words endlessly, trying to align them with the vibrant woman who used to chase laughter like a lifeline. Her absence was a gaping wound, worsened by unanswered questions. The whispers in the company corridors, the guilt etched in the faces of colleagues, always hinted at a deeper truth he could never grasp. The investigation had been swift, too swift for Henry's liking, wrapped up in a tidy file of cold facts. He had pleaded with detectives, pressed friends, even hired private investigators, but all trails led to dead ends. The conclusion was always the same. Elizabeth's fragile state of mind had supposedly pushed her to the brink, but Henry knew better. He could still picture her storming into their penthouse office, determined and sharp as ever. No, she was not broken. She was fighting. Until suddenly, she wasn't. In the present, the noise of the ballroom rushed back, bringing with it the sight of Megan Porter. She was talking animatedly now, a soft laugh escaping her lips, unaware of the storm unraveling in Henry's eyes. It was an echo of Elizabeth's laughter, and it tore at him. "Henry, there you are." A familiar voice cut through his reverie. Samuel, his longtime friend and company advisor, appeared at his side, concern tightening the lines on his face. "You're as pale as a ghost. Are you all right?" Henry's jaw tightened as he forced a nod. "I'm fine, Sam. Just..." An unexpected face in the crowd. Sam's gaze followed Henry's, settling on Megan. He hesitated, then looked back at Henry, a question forming but left unasked. "Who is she?" Henry asked quietly, the words like sandpaper against his throat. Sam's eyes narrowed. "Megan Porter? She's new in the industry. Philanthropy, I think. Came from the East Coast recently, working on some joint project with the Art Foundation." Henry took a slow breath, the pieces shifting uneasily in his mind. East Coast, new projects, and that name, Porter. It was too close to comfort, too neatly tied to an era he had tried and failed to unravel. Before he could press further, Megan's gaze found his again. This time, there was a glint of recognition, as if she too sensed the intangible thread connecting them. A pang of something sharp and unyielding spread through his chest. "Excuse me, Sam," Henry murmured, stepping toward her. When he reached her, Megan looked up, surprised but expectant. "Mr. Moore?" Twice in one evening, she joked lightly, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. "Is there something I can help you with?" Henry opened his mouth, hesitating. What could he ask without sounding deranged? That she reminded him of his dead wife? That her presence was prying open old scars and doubts he'd locked away? "I couldn't help but wonder," he began, steadying himself. "Have we met before? Your name, it feels familiar." Megan tilted her head, her smile fading just a touch. "I don't think so," she said softly. "But maybe. My mother used to live here, long before I was born." The blood in Henry's veins turned to ice. "Your mother?" His voice sounded distant, almost foreign to his own ears. "Yes, Elizabeth Porter." Megan's expression clouded slightly. "But she passed away a long time ago." Time seemed to fracture, reality splitting at the seams as the world threatened to collapse around Henry. Megan's eyes searched his face, puzzled by the look of shock mirrored back at her. "Megan," Henry whispered, a name now threaded with so much more than chance. Megan Porter walked through her modest apartment later that night, the hum of the city a comforting backdrop. She turned on a small lamp by her sofa, its warm light casting long shadows across the room. Staring at the framed photograph on the side table, a black and white portrait of a woman with kind eyes and an unmistakable resemblance to herself, Megan let out a sigh. The conversation with Henry Moore had left her with a strange unease, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing cracks in the story she'd always known. Her mother, Elizabeth Porter, had died when she was just a baby, or so she'd been told by the string of foster parents that came and went. The woman in the photograph was the only connection she had to the past, found tucked into a small suitcase the day she turned 18 and was finally free from the system. Megan's childhood had been a blur of uncertainty, shifting between foster homes and schools, always the new girl, always a step behind. She had learned early on not to ask too many questions about her past. The few times she did, she was met with vague sympathy or impatient shrugs. Her mother, as far as anyone bothered to explain, was a woman lost too soon to tragedy. The details were scarce, and those who claimed to know more never said much beyond the fact that Elizabeth had been troubled. Now, standing in her apartment with Henry Moore's name echoing in her mind, Megan felt a dissonance she couldn't shake. Why did he look at her that way, as though he'd seen a ghost? And why did his eyes carry that haunted, familiar sorrow? Determined, she reached for her laptop, the glow of the screen washing over her as she searched for more enterprises. Articles and glossy profiles filled the screen, detailing Henry Moore's achievements in philanthropy. But when she filtered through the clippings from 10 years ago, the tone shifted. Her eyes skimmed headlines like "Tragic Death of Elizabeth Moore" and "A Billionaire's Personal Tragedy." Each piece wove together a narrative of a lost wife, whispers of depression, and a mysterious end. The image of Elizabeth Moore, beautiful and poised, made Megan's breath catch. The resemblance between the woman on the screen and the photograph on her table was too striking to dismiss. The years, the hair, the mannerisms, everything fit like pieces in a puzzle Megan hadn't realized she was building. A sudden knock at her door startled her, the sharp sound jarring her from her reverie. She hesitated, heart pounding, before moving cautiously toward the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw a face she didn't expect. Henry Moore, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. She opened the door, fingers tight on the knob. "Mr. Moore," she said, unable to mask the surprise in her voice. "I'm sorry for coming unannounced," Henry began, the exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. "I know this might seem strange, but there's something we need to discuss." Megan stepped aside, a silent invitation. Henry entered, glancing around the room before his eyes found the photograph. He picked it up without asking, the tremor in his hand betraying him. "Where did you get this?" he asked, voice low and strained. "It was the only thing I had left of my mother," Megan replied, watching him closely. "I didn't know much about her, just a name, and that she died when I was a baby." Henry's expression shifted from shock to something deeper, a mixture of grief and disbelief. He set the photograph down carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. "Elizabeth didn't die when you were a baby," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "She died when she was my wife." Megan felt the ground sway beneath her, the room closing in. The truth loomed between them, too big to comprehend. "But that doesn't make sense," Megan said, the words trembling in the air. Why would I not know any of this?" Henry met her gaze, the weight of the past clinging to every syllable. "Because, Megan, someone didn't want you to." The silence that followed Henry's revelation was dense, pressing against the walls of Megan's small apartment. The ticking of the clock in the corner punctuated each second, as if counting down the moments until one of them would speak. Megan's mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of her mother she had clung to for so long with the stark new reality Henry had laid before her. Henry watched her closely, noting the subtle shift in her expression from confusion to disbelief and then to something steely and determined. He recognized that look. It was the same determination that had driven Elizabeth during the hardest days of their life together. The similarity made his throat tighten. "You're saying my mother was your wife," Megan said finally, each word measured as if she feared they might break apart if spoken too hastily. "But how? Why was I told she died when I was a baby?" Henry exhaled, the weight of the years of grief and unanswered questions evident in the way he sagged against the back of the chair she motioned him toward. He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away the memories that had resurfaced with startling clarity. "Elizabeth and I married young," he began, eyes distant, seeing a past that no longer felt just his. She was brilliant, compassionate, and had this way of making everyone feel seen. But behind closed doors, she carried a secret she refused to share, even with me. Megan listened, the outline of her mother painted by Henry's words gradually filling in with colors she had never known. "She was pregnant when we met," Henry continued, voice dropping as if revealing a sacred truth. "But by the time we were married, she'd lost the baby. It devastated her, more than I could understand at the time. But years later, she started acting differently, more anxious, secretive. I thought it was stress or maybe grief that never healed." Megan clenched her hands, trying to steady herself. "And then she had me," she said, filling in the gaps. "But if she had me while married to you, why wasn't I raised by you? Why did I grow up in foster care?" The question sliced through Henry, and he looked down, guilt seeping into his features. "Because by the time you were born, Elizabeth was already gone." The air between them turned cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. Henry's gaze met Megan's, and for a brief moment, she glimpsed the depth of his torment. "I never knew about you," he admitted, the confession painful to utter. "All I knew was that Elizabeth disappeared one day, leaving behind a note that made no sense. It said she was sorry, that she had to protect someone, and that I should trust she was making the right decision. A week later, they told me she was dead. Suicide, they said." Megan's jaw tightened, the narrative unraveling piece by painful piece. But it wasn't suicide, was it? She asked, barely above a whisper. No, Henry said, shaking his head slowly. I never believed it. Elizabeth was strong, even at her lowest. But after she died, or after they said she died, I started digging. I found things that didn't add up, loose threads that led nowhere, people who wouldn't talk. I thought I was losing my mind. Megan's mind spun with the implications. If Henry hadn't known she existed, then someone had deliberately hidden her. But why? And who had orchestrated such a deception? Do you remember anything about the people she was with before she left? Megan asked, the urge to piece together this unknown chapter of her life growing with every word. Henry's eyes darkened, memories long buried surfacing reluctantly. She had started meeting with people I didn't know. At first, I thought they were friends from her charity work or colleagues she kept private, but there was an edge to it. A man in particular, Gabriel Hayes. He was charismatic, persuasive. Elizabeth seemed drawn to him, and I couldn't figure out why. The name sent a shiver down Megan's spine. I've heard that name, she said, the realization sudden and unwelcome. He's involved in some of the foundations I work with. I never met him personally, but his reputation precedes him. He's powerful, influential. Henry's jaw clenched. If Hayes was involved, it means this goes deeper than I feared. He was known for more than his public persona. Behind the scenes, he pulled strings, manipulated people to get what he wanted. If Elizabeth felt the need to run, he might have been the reason. The pieces clicked together, but the picture they formed was more ominous than Megan anticipated. If Hayes had been a shadow over her mother's life, he might still be a threat now. And if he had hidden her existence from Henry, it was likely for reasons that extended beyond simple control. Megan felt her pulse quicken as fear laced with newfound resolve coursed through her veins. Then he's still out there, still in control of whatever kept my mother silent. She glanced at Henry, their connection forged through shared loss and the sudden urgency of unmasking the truth. We need to find out why. Henry nodded, the grief in his eyes receding as determination took its place. We will, he promised. But we need to be careful. If Hayes orchestrated this, he won't let us get close without a fight. Megan's heart thudded in her chest. The photograph on the table, once a remnant of a past she had never known, now felt like a lifeline, tethering her to a mother who had fought in ways Megan was only beginning to understand, to protect her. It was time for her to pick up that fight. For the first time in years, Henry felt something stir inside him that was not just the ache of loss. It was hope, fragile but real. He met Megan's determined gaze, recognizing in her the same fierce spirit that had driven Elizabeth. They weren't just chasing answers. They were confronting a truth that had waited too long to be uncovered. And whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The next morning, the sun barely peeked over the horizon when Henry parked outside Megan's building. The city was still waking, the streets brushed with the soft, orange glow of dawn. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as the implications of their newfound connection settled heavily on his mind. A new chapter, darker and more twisted than he had anticipated, was about to be opened. Megan stepped out of the building, her face marked by sleepless hours spent chasing shadows of memories and truths half remembered. She clutched a leather notebook, worn at the edges, that she'd retrieved from a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were notes she'd kept from the rare stories foster parents shared and bits of information she'd gathered during her search for any trace of her mother. Henry glanced at the notebook as she slid into the passenger seat. "What's that?" he asked, his tone guarded but tinged with hope. "Something I should have looked at more closely," Megan replied, running her fingers over the cracked spine. "There might be clues in here, fragments from the people who knew my mother or claimed to. I didn't have any reason to believe them before, but now—" Henry nodded, understanding that whatever was in that notebook could hold threads connecting Elizabeth's hidden life to the present. He started the car, and they drove in silence to his office, where they could pore over the contents away from prying eyes. The Moore Enterprises building stood tall, its glass facade reflecting the rising sun. They entered through a private side entrance, bypassing the usual flurry of employees and security. Henry's office was spacious, lined with dark wood and accented by the muted hum of the city below. Megan settled into one of the leather chairs while Henry pulled the heavy drapes shut, creating a cocoon of privacy. "Let's see what we have," he said, more to himself than to Megan. She flipped open the notebook, its pages filled with careful handwriting, newspaper clippings, and photographs glued at odd angles. One of the first entries caught her eye. It was dated almost 20 years ago, a yellowed piece of paper with shaky penmanship. "Lizzie's in too deep," it read, followed by a name that sent a chill down her spine. Gabriel H. She glanced at Henry, who recognized the name immediately, the corner of his mouth tightening in anger. "He was in her life longer than I knew," Henry murmured, scanning the page. "What else does it say?" Megan turned the page, revealing a faded photograph of her mother, younger and smiling, standing beside a man with piercing eyes and a smile that didn't quite reach them. It was Gabriel Hayes. Next to it, scrawled hastily, were the words, "Never trust him. He holds the strings." Henry leaned back, piecing together the implications. Gabriel had been more than a fleeting presence. He was woven into Elizabeth's life, influencing it with a subtle menace that only now became clear. "Did your mother ever mention him by name in anything you remember?" Henry asked. Megan shook her head. "I was too young when she died, and none of the stories I heard ever added up. It was like everyone knew a different version of her. Then why would she go to such lengths to hide you?" Henry's voice was taut, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Before Megan could answer, a knock at the door made them both freeze. Henry exchanged a tense look with her before crossing the room and opening the door a crack. It was Samuel, Henry's trusted advisor, his face grave. "I heard you were in early," Samuel said, eyes flicking to Megan for a brief moment before settling back on Henry. "There's something you need to know." Henry stepped aside, letting Samuel enter. The older man glanced at the notebook in Megan's lap, sensing the atmosphere charged with urgency. He lowered his voice. "There's talk, whispers in some circles about Gabriel Hayes looking into old contacts, stirring things up again." Henry's heart sank. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. "Why now?" he muttered, more to himself. Samuel's eyes darkened. "I don't know. But if he's trying to reconnect with those who knew Elizabeth or had any involvement with her, it means he's aware of something." Megan's chest tightened, the pages of her notebook feeling heavier in her lap. "We need to find out what he's after," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "If he hid my existence once, he could have a reason to keep it buried." Samuel glanced at Henry, then back at Megan, nodding slowly. "I'll make some discreet inquiries, but you need to be careful. If Hayes senses you're onto him, he won't hesitate to protect his interests." As Samuel left, the room fell into a heavy silence. Henry paced, the air around him crackling with tension. "This changes everything. We can't just wait for Hayes to make his move. We need to stay ahead of him." Megan stood, tucking the notebook under her arm. "Then we start with whatever connections he has to my mother's past. There has to be someone, who can tell us more." A thought struck Henry, and he paused mid-step. There was someone, an old colleague of Elizabeth's. She was one of the last people to see her before she disappeared. Frances Donovan. "Can we trust her?" Megan asked, wary of being led into another dead end. "She was loyal to Elizabeth," Henry said, conviction hardening his tone. "If she knows anything, she'll tell us." Megan's eyes met his, both of them understanding that this was only the beginning. The answers they sought were layered under years of lies and fear, and every step closer to the truth would come with risks they couldn't yet measure. But they were united in their purpose, bound by the same loss, the same yearning for resolution. With newfound resolve, Henry reached for his phone to make the call. It was time to find Frances Donovan and start unearthing the truth, piece by dangerous piece. The following afternoon, Henry and Megan found themselves outside a small, ivy-clad house nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The neighborhood felt worlds away from the towering skyscrapers of the city, its peace a stark contrast to the turmoil bubbling beneath their surface. Henry glanced at Megan, her jaw set with determination, before stepping up to the front door and ringing the bell. A long moment passed before footsteps echoed from inside. The door opened to reveal Frances Donovan, a woman in her late 60s with sharp eyes that hadn't lost their keen edge despite the passing years. Her silver hair was pulled back into a practical bun, and she regarded them with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Henry Moore," she said, crossing her arms. "It's been a long time." "Too long, Frances," Henry replied, his voice softer than usual, tinged with an old sadness. He stepped aside, gesturing to Megan. "This is Megan Porter. We need to talk about Elizabeth." At the mention of the name, Frances's eyes flickered, an old memory sparking to life. She sighed, motioning them inside. The living room was cozy, filled with books and the faint scent of lavender. Megan took a seat on the edge of a worn armchair, her fingers tightening around her notebook. Frances sat across from them, studying Megan with a gaze that seemed to peel back layers. "You have her eyes," she murmured. The statement hung in the air, charged with unspoken recognition. Henry broke the silence. "Frances, we're here because we need to know what really happened to Elizabeth. We know Gabriel Hayes was involved, and we believe he might have hidden Megan's existence from me and from the world." Frances's expression hardened at the mention of Hayes. She leaned back, exhaling deeply. "That man was poison," she said. "Elizabeth trusted too easily, believed she could change people, save them from themselves. But with Hayes, it was different. He had a way of making people feel indebted, trapped." Megan's heart pounded as Frances continued, her voice heavy with the weight of years. "Elizabeth started confiding in me when she felt cornered," Frances said, eyes drifting toward the window as if watching ghosts from the past. She spoke of secrets she discovered, things that Hayes was involved in, business deals and partnerships that went beyond the law. But there was something more personal, something that terrified her. Henry's breath caught. "Megan," he said softly, as if the answer had been there all along. Frances nodded slowly, her gaze meeting Megan's. "Yes, Elizabeth found out she was pregnant again, after years of heartbreak. But this time, she knew it would put both of you in danger." Megan swallowed hard, her vision blurring for a moment as the truth settled in. The idea that her mother had been fighting to protect her changed everything. It wasn't abandonment, it was sacrifice. "But why didn't she come to me?" Henry's voice cracked, the betrayal of years spent in ignorance surfacing. "Why would she choose to go it alone?" Frances's eyes softened, and for the first time, her tone was laced with regret. "Henry, she was trying to shield you. She knew Hayes had a hold on the company and that your involvement would put you both at risk. By pretending to die, she thought she could draw Hayes' attention away and protect Megan in secret. But something went wrong." Megan leaned forward, every nerve in her body on edge. "What happened?" Frances shook her head, the pain of not knowing etched in her features. "I don't know all the details, only that Elizabeth's plan didn't unfold as she hoped. When I last saw her, she was desperate, trying to arrange safe passage out of the country. The next thing I heard was that she was dead, and everything was covered up." Henry sat in stunned silence, piecing together the fragments of the past that never fit before. "Hayes was always careful, always one step ahead," he said bitterly. "He must have known she was planning to leave and cut her off." Megan felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea that a man like Hayes, whose name surfaced in whispers of corruption and influence, had shaped her entire existence without her knowledge was suffocating. Frances leaned forward, her eyes sharp again. "If Hayes is resurfacing now, it means he thinks whatever Elizabeth was hiding is still out there. That secret she died for. It might be the reason he's interested in you, Megan." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a storm cloud. Megan took a deep breath, determined to reclaim control. "Then we need to find out what that secret is," she said, her voice steady. "If it was important enough for her to sacrifice everything, we can't let Hayes win now." Frances nodded solemnly. "There is someone else who might know more," she said. "An old friend of Elizabeth's who worked on projects with her before things fell apart. His name is Thomas Kwan. He dropped off the map after Elizabeth's death, but kept a low profile overseas. If anyone knows what Elizabeth was hiding, it's him." Henry stood, the urgency palpable. "Do you know where we can find him?" Frances hesitated, then went to a cabinet, retrieving an old address book. She flipped through the pages with practiced fingers and stopped at a handwritten note. "Last I heard, he was in Singapore. If he's kept his head down this long, he won't be easy to find. But it's a start." Megan exchanged a glance with Henry, a newfound fire in their eyes. They now had a name, a direction, and the understanding that Elizabeth's fight hadn't ended with her death. It had been passed to them, whether they wanted it or not. "Thank you, Francis," Henry said, the gratitude raw in his voice. Francis touched his arm lightly. "Be careful. Hayes has eyes and ears in places you wouldn't expect. Whatever Elizabeth was trying to protect is worth more than we know." As they left the small house, the weight of their mission settled on Megan's shoulders. The stakes had never been clearer, nor the path more treacherous. But now, armed with more than shadows and speculation, they were ready to confront the legacy Elizabeth had left behind. And this time, they would not be silenced. The flight to Singapore was long, stretching across the dark expanse of the Pacific as Henry and Megan sat side by side, their thoughts a turbulent mix of anticipation and dread. The cabin lights dimmed, casting long shadows across the silent rows of passengers. Megan glanced at Henry, noting the way his eyes flickered with memories he hadn't voiced. His jaw was set, each passing hour deepening the furrow between his brows. "Do you think Thomas Kwan will talk to us?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry exhaled, the sound filled with more doubt than certainty. "I don't know. He's kept himself hidden for so long. If he's survived this far, he'll be careful." Megan turned to the small window, watching as the horizon began to blur with the soft hues of dawn. The idea of confronting a man who had been part of her mother's secret life sent a shiver down her spine. But there was no turning back now. Elizabeth's story had been buried long enough, and Megan was determined to unearth it, no matter how painful the truth might be. When they landed, the sticky heat of Singapore wrapped around them like a heavy cloak. The city pulsed with life, towering skyscrapers glistening under the midday sun, bustling markets brimming with the clamor of voices, and the scent of street food carried on warm breezes. But the vibrant chaos did little to soothe Megan's nerves. She glanced at Henry, who was scanning the crowd with a practiced, cautious gaze. Their search led them to an unassuming tea house in a quieter corner of the city. The establishment was tucked between rows of old shop houses, its sign barely visible beneath a canopy of crimson bougainvillea. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine, and the soft murmur of patrons created a steady, calming hum. Henry spoke briefly to the elderly man behind the counter, who nodded once before pointing to a corner table shrouded in shadows. Sitting there was a man with dark hair streaked with silver, his eyes hidden behind round spectacles. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. It was Thomas Kwan. "Kwan," Henry said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Thank you for seeing us." Thomas gestured for them to sit, his gaze shifting from Henry to Megan. Recognition flashed in his eyes, and his fingers, resting on a porcelain cup, trembled ever so slightly. "Elizabeth's daughter," he said softly, as though speaking her name might conjure a ghost. Megan's throat tightened, but she held his gaze. "Yes, and we need to know what happened to her. We believe you have answers." Thomas leaned back, the weight of decades pressing down on him. His eyes shifted between exhaustion and a reluctance born of fear. "I left that world behind for a reason," he said, his voice low and measured. "Gabriel Hayes does not forget, nor does he forgive." "Then you know why we're here," Henry pressed, leaning forward. "We found pieces of Elizabeth's life that point to something larger. Something Hayes was willing to kill for." Thomas's eyes narrowed, the name triggering a flicker of anger that cut through his caution. "You shouldn't have come," he said, voice tight. "Looking for the past will only invite danger into your present." Megan refused to flinch. "Danger is already here, Mr. Kwan. Hayes is looking for something Elizabeth left behind, something connected to me. We need to know what it is before he finds it first." A long silence fell between them. Finally, Thomas removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if the gesture could ease the memories clawing at him. Elizabeth was one of the bravest people I knew. When she came to me that last time, she spoke of secrets buried within more enterprises, deals Hayes made in the shadows, protected by power and silence. But it wasn't just money or influence. It was leverage, something that could dismantle him completely. Henry's jaw tightened, the anger in his chest reigniting. And Megan? How does she fit into all this? Thomas's expression softened, tinged with regret. Elizabeth discovered that Hayes was more than just a business rival. He was connected to something deeper, a network that thrived on fear and control. When she found out she was pregnant with Megan, she knew that child was leverage against her, a weakness Hayes could exploit. That's why she left. She needed to protect her daughter. Megan's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. So why didn't she come back for me? Why did I grow up without knowing any of this? Thomas shook his head slowly. Elizabeth's plan was to come back when it was safe, but she underestimated Hayes. He intercepted her attempts, ensured she couldn't reach you, and orchestrated her death to send a message. It was only after she was gone that the magnitude of what she'd found truly became clear to me. What did she find? Henry asked, his voice tight with urgency. Thomas hesitated before speaking. A ledger, a record of every clandestine deal, every blackmail Hayes ever orchestrated. If that ledger were exposed, it would destroy his empire and implicate powerful allies who would do anything to stay protected. Elizabeth managed to hide it, but only she knew where. Megan felt a spark of determination ignite within her. Then we have to find it. Thomas's face darkened with concern. If Hayes knows you're looking for it, he won't stop until you're silenced. You need to be prepared for what's coming. Henry exchanged a look with Megan, the bond between them strengthened by the gravity of their mission. They were not just fighting for the truth anymore. They were fighting for Elizabeth's legacy, for justice long overdue. We're prepared, Megan said, the conviction in her voice unwavering. And we won't stop until we finish what she started. Thomas nodded, a hint of admiration breaking through his guarded expression. Then I'll help you. But remember, this path you're on, it's not just a fight for answers. It's a battle for survival. The streets of Singapore bustled with life, neon signs flickering in the humid night as crowds weaved through narrow market alleys. Henry and Megan sat in a small cafe, tucked into a corner where the sounds of street vendors and passing scooters were muted to a distant hum. The glow of their phone screens reflected in their eyes as they pored over hastily gathered research, notes scrawled by hand, and whispers of leads from contacts that Thomas Kwan had quietly activated since their meeting. Thomas sat across from them, fingers steepled as he considered the risks. His face was shadowed with fatigue, years of living in self-imposed exile etched into every line. He leaned in, lowering his voice. The ledger's last known connection was through an intermediary Elizabeth trusted, a courier who worked for more enterprises years ago, someone Hayes wouldn't have suspected. If we're going to find the ledger, we need to trace that courier. Do you have a name? Henry's eyes were sharp, his body coiled with tension. Thomas nodded slowly. Li Wei. He was discreet, loyal, and vanished right after Elizabeth's death. If he's still alive, he might be the key to finding where she hid it. Megan absorbed the name, the realization sinking in that the search had become a hunt, where each move could expose them to Hayes's reach. She looked up from the notes, meeting Henry's gaze. They both knew they couldn't afford any missteps. Hours later, they found themselves outside a dimly lit apartment block in the district known for its older, unassuming buildings. The corridors were narrow, lined with potted plants and the faint aroma of incense. Thomas stood back as Henry knocked on the door with a steady hand. After a tense pause, the door opened a crack, revealing a wiry man in his late 50s with deep-set eyes that darted between them. Li Wei's hair was more salt than pepper, and a scar ran along his jawline, a reminder of past conflicts. He squinted at Henry, recognition sparking a guarded look. More. His voice was rough, as if he hadn't used it much in recent years. Yes, Henry said, his tone measured. We need to talk about Elizabeth. Li Wei stiffened, the mention of her name pulling a shadow over his features. "I don't know anything," he said, starting to close the door. Megan stepped forward, desperation clear in her voice. "Please, if you knew her, then you know she wouldn't want this silence. My mother died trying to protect something that's now putting us in danger." At the word mother, Li Wei's eyes widened, and he hesitated. He glanced at the hallway, then at Megan's face, studying her features for traces of Elizabeth. Something in her expression seemed to shift the balance. "Come in," he said quietly, stepping aside to let them through. The apartment was sparse, the walls bare except for a faded map of the city pinned above an old desk. A kettle hissed on the stove, filling the room with the scent of green tea. Li Wei moved with the caution of someone who trusted nothing and no one. "You shouldn't be here," he said, pouring 3 cups and placing them on the low table. "Hayes is watching, always." "We know," Thomas replied, his voice calm but urgent. "But we have no choice." The ledger Elizabeth hid. "It's the only way to expose him and protect Megan. We need to know where she left it." Li Wei's face twitched at the mention of the ledger, and he looked at Megan with something akin to pity. Elizabeth was clever, braver than most. She told me if anything happened to her, to keep moving and stay silent. I've honored that for years. But if you're her daughter, then maybe it's time. He walked to the desk, opening a drawer and pulling out an old, yellowing envelope. He handed it to Megan, who took it with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple map, a hand-drawn path through what appeared to be a familiar section of the city. On the back, Elizabeth's handwriting looped in a small, urgent script, "For when the time comes. Trust only those who seek it for the right reasons." Megan traced the lines of the map, the weight of her mother's words pressing on her chest. She glanced at Henry, who nodded, silently urging her to continue. "This leads to an old temple on the outskirts," Li Wei said, his voice dropping even lower. "It was a place Elizabeth loved, a sanctuary where no one would think to look. But if Hayes finds out you're going there—" "We know the risk," Henry interrupted, his resolve unyielding. "But this is our only chance." Li Wei's eyes softened, and for a moment, the weariness in his posture lifted. "Elizabeth was my friend. I hope you find what she left behind. But be quick and be silent. If Hayes suspects even a whisper, he'll strike." The drive to the outskirts of the city felt longer than it was, the weight of the envelope and the map a silent reminder of how precarious their situation had become. The streets thinned out as they left the bustling heart of Singapore, replaced by narrow, winding roads that led to older parts of the city rarely visited by tourists. The temple appeared at the end of a dirt path, half hidden by trees that loomed like silent sentinels. It was modest, the stone steps worn by time, and the roof adorned with carvings that seemed to whisper forgotten stories. Megan clutched the map as they climbed, each step echoing in the quiet night air. Inside, the temple was cool, the scent of old incense mingling with the earthy aroma of stone. Shadows played along the walls, cast by the dim glow of votive candles. Megan followed the map's instructions, searching for the alcove that had been marked in Elizabeth's careful hand. Henry moved beside her, his flashlight casting brief slivers of light that danced across centuries-old carvings. "There," Megan whispered, spotting a small crevice in the stone wall behind a weathered statue. She reached in, her fingers brushing something hard and cold. Pulling it out, she revealed a small, iron box, its surface marred by rust but still intact. The lock was simple, and with a quick twist, it clicked open. Inside was a leather-bound book, worn and faded but unmistakably important. Megan's breath caught as she flipped through the pages, each one filled with meticulously recorded transactions, names, dates, and details that would unravel everything Hayes had worked to conceal. Henry exhaled, the tension momentarily giving way to relief. But before they could celebrate, a noise outside shattered the fragile peace. A car door slamming, followed by hurried footsteps. "They're here," Thomas said, eyes wide as he backed toward the entrance. "We need to move. Now." Megan stuffed the ledger into her bag, heart pounding as adrenaline surged. Henry reached for her arm, guiding her toward a side exit Thomas had pointed out earlier. The night that once felt heavy with anticipation now pulsed with the urgency of escape. Their fight was no longer just for answers. It had become a battle to stay alive long enough to reveal the truth. The narrow side exit of the temple led Henry, Megan, and Thomas into a dense thicket of trees. The jungle air was thick, almost stifling, with the humid scent of earth and leaves layering around them. The only sounds were their rapid, quiet breaths and the distant hum of traffic far from where they stood. Shadows flitted between the trees as they moved, hurried but careful, each of them acutely aware of the possibility that Hayes's men were only steps behind. Henry tightened his grip on Megan's arm, his voice a low murmur. "Stay close, both of you. We don't know how many of them are out there." Thomas gave a single nod, his eyes sharp and scanning the darkness. Despite the years that had passed since he last faced such danger, he moved with a practiced precision that hinted at an old survival instinct coming back to life. They crept along a narrow path, guided by the faint glow of Henry's flashlight held close to the ground to avoid detection. Megan's mind raced with the weight of the leather-bound ledger tucked against her side. The secrets it held were more than just numbers and dates. They were keys to a web of power, each one able to unbind the empire that Hayes had built over decades. A rustle to their right made Megan flinch, her breath catching as she spun to look. But it was only a bird, startled into flight. She exchanged a glance with Henry, who gave her a reassuring nod. "We're close," Thomas whispered, pointing ahead to where the trees thinned, leading to an old road half covered in moss. "We can follow that road to a safe house on the edge of town. It's where I used to stay when I needed to disappear." They slipped onto the road, their pace quickening now that they had solid ground beneath their feet. Megan adjusted the strap on her shoulder, ensuring the ledger was secure. Each step echoed with the reminder of her mother's fight, of the years Elizabeth had spent hiding in the shadows to keep her safe. As they hurried along the road, headlights flared behind them. Henry glanced back, and his eyes widened. A sleek black SUV was advancing down the road, its engine a low growl against the stillness of the night. Without a word, they darted off the road, diving into the cover of the dense jungle once more. "Keep moving," Henry urged, gripping Megan's arm as he led her deeper into the underbrush. Thomas was right behind them, his breaths labored but determined. The SUV stopped, and doors slammed as footsteps hit the gravel. Megan could hear voices, low and tense, in a language she didn't recognize. The men moved in a grid pattern, their flashlights slicing through the dark foliage, illuminating patches of greenery and the occasional trunk. They spoke quickly, and one of them pointed directly into the area where Henry, Megan, and Thomas crouched. Henry mouthed, "Don't move," his voice a barely audible breath. Megan held her breath, clutching the ledger tightly against her chest. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears, loud and insistent. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Megan's eyes darted to the ground, searching for any sign of cover if they needed to move. Just as one of the beams of light arced over their heads, Thomas lifted a hand, signaling for them to crawl slowly away, inch by inch. They moved quietly, painfully aware that any sound could give them away. Suddenly, Thomas slipped, his foot catching on a root that jutted out of the ground. He managed to stifle his gasp, but the disturbance was enough to draw the attention of one of the men. The flashlight beam jerked in their direction, sweeping over the ground with increasing urgency. Megan's pulse spiked, a wave of dread washing over her as she pressed herself flat against the damp earth. One of the men muttered something, and the beam swept past them, moving further into the jungle. They waited, tense and still, until the footsteps began to recede. After what felt like an eternity, Henry motioned for them to rise slowly, moving in the opposite direction from the men who had nearly found them. Thomas limped slightly, his face pale with pain, but he waved them off when they tried to help. "Let's keep moving," he said, his voice strained but resolute. "We can't stop here." They continued on, eventually reaching a narrow path that led them further from the main road. The air grew colder as they climbed a gentle incline, and soon they saw the faint outline of an abandoned shack, hidden under a thick canopy of trees. Thomas gestured toward it, his voice low. "We can rest here for a moment," he said, wiping sweat from his brow. They won't think to look this far out. Inside the shack, the musty smell of decaying wood and stale air wrapped around them. Henry inspected the small space, which held only an old wooden table and a few rickety chairs. Megan leaned against the wall, catching her breath as she looked down at the ledger in her hands. The significance of it felt even heavier now that they had narrowly escaped capture. Henry broke the silence, his tone grim. "We need to think carefully about our next steps. Hayes's men aren't going to stop until they have us or that ledger." Megan nodded, her gaze fixed on the worn leather cover. "I can't believe my mother was in hiding for so long because of this," she murmured, her voice wavering. "All she wanted was to protect me, and she paid for it with her life." Henry's hand rested on her shoulder, a reassuring weight. "We're going to finish what she started," he said, "but we have to be smart. This ledger won't just implicate Hayes. It could drag down everyone he's ever worked with. That's why he's so desperate to keep it buried." Thomas nodded in agreement. "The people connected to Hayes are powerful, and they won't go down without a fight. This is a dangerous game, one that cost Elizabeth everything. You have to be prepared for that." Megan looked at both men, the resolve in her eyes hardening. "I know the risks, but if my mother could face them alone, I can face them now, with both of you." They exchanged determined nods, their unspoken alliance strengthened by the shadows they now shared. Henry pulled out his phone, checking for any missed messages. They had left Singapore quietly, without alerting anyone back home, but he knew that every moment they were out of sight was a chance for Hayes's network to close in. Thomas leaned forward, his voice steady. "There's a way we can expose Hayes without confronting him directly, at least at first. I have a contact, a journalist who's been trying to dig up dirt on him for years. If we give him enough information to start a story, Hayes will have to divide his resources to suppress it. That could buy us time." Henry considered this, his gaze sharpening. "It's a risky move, but it could work. If Hayes is distracted, he might be less focused on tracking us." Megan clutched the ledger tighter, the sense of purpose mingling with fear. "Let's do it. Every minute we wait gives him more time to find us." Thomas nodded, already pulling out a small notepad and pen. "We'll need to summarize the key points of the ledger without revealing everything. Enough to start the story, but not enough to put us at risk." As they worked together, the faint rays of dawn began to filter through the gaps in the walls of the shack. The golden light cast long shadows, illuminating the exhaustion etched in their faces, but also the determination that fueled them. They were no longer just running. They were preparing to fight. By the time the sun had fully risen, they had crafted a plan that might just give them the advantage they needed. The battle was only beginning, but as they looked at each other, a shared spark of resilience passed between them. For Elizabeth, for justice, and for the truth that had been hidden too long, they would see this through. The morning sun poured through the narrow windows of the shack, casting a warm glow that felt almost surreal against the tension that pulsed between them. Henry, Megan, and Thomas sat huddled around the ledger, their plans finalized and their resolve hardening as the final pieces of Elizabeth's story and her sacrifice took shape before them. As they left the shelter of the shack, they knew their every step had to be carefully calculated. Thomas's contact, a veteran journalist named Simon Lau, had agreed to meet them in a secluded park on the outskirts of town. Simon had a reputation for exposing high-profile corruption, and he understood the stakes. This story was bigger than anything he'd ever covered before, and it would rattle cages across industries and governments alike. They arrived at the park under the cover of dense trees and winding paths. Simon was already waiting, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a wary expression. As they approached, he extended his hand to Henry, his grip firm and confident. "Mr. Moore, Megan," he greeted, then turned to Thomas with a nod of respect. "I understand you have something Hayes would kill to keep hidden." Henry handed Simon a slim folder, an extract from the ledger with enough key information to support their story but without the full details. Simon scanned the documents, his expression shifting from professional curiosity to something darker. "This is enough to ignite a firestorm," he said, his voice low but filled with excitement. "If we release this strategically, the public backlash alone will force an investigation. Hayes won't be able to sweep this under the rug. Megan watched him carefully, a question lingering in her mind. Are you prepared for the consequences? She asked. Hayes will do anything to stop this. He has eyes everywhere, and if he suspects even a whisper, he'll come after you too. Simon nodded, his gaze steady. I've been waiting for something like this my entire career. Men like Hayes have evaded justice for too long. It's time for him to face the consequences. With their agreement sealed, Simon left, disappearing into the trees with the folder clutched tightly to his chest. Now, all they could do was wait and hope that the story would hit before Hayes's network could track them down. The plan was simple yet dangerous. Expose Hayes's dealings, create enough public pressure to force a legal investigation, and take advantage of the chaos to finally bring him down. As night fell, they took refuge in a modest hotel, their nerves frayed by the ticking clock and the weight of their plan. Henry paced the room, tension radiating off him. Megan sat by the window, her gaze distant as she held the ledger close, a final piece of her mother's legacy now wrapped in her own mission for justice. Hours passed. Then, in the early morning darkness, the notifications started to flood in. Simon's article had gone live, plastered across every major news outlet in the region. Headlines screamed of corruption, blackmail, illegal offshore accounts, and a web of influence that extended to the highest levels of power. The article detailed enough evidence to suggest a conspiracy so sprawling that it was impossible to ignore. Hayes's name was front and center, his image broadcasted as the face of everything that had gone unchecked for decades. Almost immediately, Henry's phone buzzed with messages. Some were from board members at more enterprises, expressing shock or confusion. Others were from contacts warning him to lay low. News outlets speculated wildly, and as the story grew, the public outrage became palpable. Social media was flooded with calls for justice, demands for investigations, and, to Henry and Megan's relief, nothing yet about their involvement. Megan felt a surge of hope, tempered by the gravity of what they had unleashed. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked Henry, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. Henry met her gaze, his own eyes filled with cautious optimism. "It's enough to put Hayes on the defensive. Now, the world is watching. It's only a matter of time before he's forced to answer for his crimes." Their relief, however, was short-lived. As dawn crept into the sky, a message appeared on Henry's phone from an unknown number. He opened it, his face going pale as he read the words aloud. "You've made a grave mistake. You won't make it out of this alive." Megan's heart clenched, the weight of their actions bearing down on her. Hayes was on the move, and they were in his crosshairs. They could no longer afford to wait and see if the story would protect them. They needed to act. Thomas spoke up, his voice steady. "There's a private jet waiting for us at the airfield, arranged by a friend who understands what's at stake. It'll take us out of here quietly. Hayes won't expect us to leave so soon." Without a word, they gathered their things and slipped out of the hotel, making their way to the airfield under the cover of early morning shadows. The journey felt surreal, each step carrying them further from the city that had held Elizabeth's secrets and closer to safety. As they boarded the jet, Henry turned to Megan, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens next, you need to know how proud Elizabeth would be of you. She fought alone for so long, but you finished what she started." Megan's throat tightened as she looked back at him, her own voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't have done this without you. She left us both with pieces of the truth, and together, we were able to make it whole." The engines roared to life, and within moments, they were airborne, leaving Singapore behind. Below, Hayes's empire was unraveling, each new revelation chipping away at the foundation of his power. And though he would undoubtedly try to recover, the public outrage and the demand for justice would keep him entangled long enough for them to disappear. In the quiet of the cabin, Megan opened the ledger one last time, her fingers brushing over her mother's handwriting. Each entry was a reminder of the courage Elizabeth had shown, the sacrifices she'd made, and the life she'd built to protect her daughter from the darkness that surrounded her. The final page held a message written in delicate, looping letters, one she had overlooked before. "To my daughter, you are stronger than you know. This fight was never mine alone. It was always yours, too." Trust yourself, and remember that love is the one thing they can never take from you." Megan closed the ledger, tears slipping down her cheeks as she felt her mother's presence, fierce and enduring. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of closure, of peace, settle over her. She had done what Elizabeth could not, and her mother's legacy was no longer shrouded in darkness. As the plane soared into the sky, Henry placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. They were free now, bound not by the secrets of the past but by the promise of a future forged in truth. They both knew that Hayes's reach was vast, that he would try to claw his way back. But the foundations of his empire had been shaken, and the truth was now in the open, an unstoppable force that no amount of power could bury. Together, they faced the horizon, ready to build a life free from the shadows of the past. A life where Elizabeth's memory would be honored not with whispers and hidden regrets, but with the light of a family finally at peace. Months had passed since the morning they had fled Singapore. Life had changed in ways Megan could barely comprehend. She had returned to the United States under a new name, her public identity scrubbed clean with the help of Thomas and a few well-placed allies who had quietly supported their fight. The firestorm set off by the article continued to burn, the media hounding Hayes and his associates relentlessly as new allegations surfaced and lawsuits piled up, one after another. Hayes himself had gone into hiding, a ghost of his former powerful self. His associates had turned on him, each scrambling to preserve their own interests as investigations spread to every corner of his network. Governments, corporate watchdogs, and human rights organizations launched inquiries into his dealings, unearthing truths that shook entire industries. The whispers of conspiracy that had once seemed like paranoid fantasies were now front-page headlines, driving public outcry and calls for justice. But while Hayes faced the unraveling of his empire, Megan and Henry focused on rebuilding what remained of their lives. They had found a quiet town on the New England coast, a place where the world moved a bit slower and people asked fewer questions. Here, they settled into an old, weathered house by the shore, surrounded by rugged cliffs and windswept trees that reminded Megan of her mother's strength and resilience. The house itself had become a sanctuary, its walls lined with the few remnants of her past that she could keep. A photograph of Elizabeth that she had framed and placed on the mantel, a vase of lilies she changed weekly, and in the study, the leather-bound ledger, now locked away in a drawer. The ledger was no longer a weapon, but a keepsake, a reminder of what they had fought to uncover and the life her mother had sacrificed to protect her. Henry, too, was adapting to a new life, one stripped of the corporate ambitions and polished appearances that had once defined him. In the mornings, he would walk down to the rocky beach with a mug of coffee, his gaze lost on the horizon, a man unburdened at last by the secrets and pressures of his old world. His once sharp suits had been traded for sweaters and work boots, and he spent his afternoons tending a small garden they had planted together, something Elizabeth had always dreamed of having but never could. Megan watched him as he worked, a quiet contentment filling her heart. He had become more than a mentor or a link to her past. Henry was family, and she felt her mother's love reflected in the way he looked out for her. They had both found a sense of peace here, an oasis after years of turmoil, and for the first time in her life, Megan felt truly free. One late afternoon, as a gentle autumn breeze drifted through the house, Megan pulled out a box she had kept tucked away since their arrival. Inside were letters she had written to her mother over the years, notes scribbled in moments of loneliness or confusion, addressed to a woman she could never reach but always felt close to. She sat by the fireplace, reading through the pages, each one a testament to the journey she'd taken to find her mother's truth. As she read, Henry entered the room, carrying an old leather-bound book. He held it out to her, his expression soft and encouraging. "I thought it might be time to add to Elizabeth's story," he said. "We could write it down, all of it. Her life, her legacy, the fight we waged to bring her memory justice." Megan smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she took the book from him. It felt right, creating a record of their journey, something that future generations could understand. Elizabeth's life, her courage, and her love deserved to be remembered in its entirety, not as a secret buried in shadows. Together, they spent the evening by the fire, writing Elizabeth's story. They wrote of her fierce loyalty, her unwavering hope, and the quiet strength that had guided Meghan throughout her life. They wrote about the ledger and its revelations, about the long fight to escape Hayes's reach, and about the peace they had finally found on this quiet coast. As they wrote, a calm settled over them. It was a closing of a chapter, the turning of a page that had been stuck for far too long. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, they had filled the first pages of a story that no one would ever erase. A testament to Elizabeth, a mother who had fought against darkness and whose light now shone through Meghan's own life. In the months that followed, Meghan began working as an advocate for those who had been wronged by men like Hayes. She started a foundation in her mother's name, the Elizabeth Foundation, dedicated to helping those who had been silenced or oppressed, particularly those in industries where Hayes's influence had cast the longest shadows. She became a voice for justice, determined to give others the closure she had found and to use her pain as a source of strength. Through her work, she met others who had been impacted by Hayes and his associates, people who had suffered in silence and who now found hope through her foundation. With every case she took on, every life she helped rebuild, she felt her mother's presence guiding her, proud and unwavering. Henry stood by her side through it all, a pillar of support, watching her grow into the woman Elizabeth had always believed she could be. Their bond, forged through hardship and healing, became the cornerstone of the life they built. A life free from fear, steeped in purpose, and held together by the memory of a woman whose love had defied even death. And as the years went on, they continued to live quietly in their coastal haven, watching as the world changed and as justice, slowly but surely, made its way through the cracks Hayes had left behind. In the end, they found not just the peace they had sought but a new beginning, one where Elizabeth's spirit lived on, woven into the fabric of their days and the legacy they were creating together.